It was a sweltering midday in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood. The sun blazed down on the neatly trimmed lawns and identical houses, casting long shadows across the street. The only sound was the faint hum of a lawnmower in the distance. But the tranquility was about to be shattered. Standing in front of her modest home, Elena Martinez crossed her arms, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before her. A uniformed code enforcement officer, clipboard in hand, was squinting at the fence that bordered her property. Just a few feet away, Margaret Hargrove, the self-important president of the Maplewood Homeowners Association, HOA, stood with her hands on her hips, her face a mask of barely contained fury. "You've got some real nerve, you know that?" Margaret spat, her voice dripping with venom. Elena raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but defiant. "For what exactly?" Margaret let out a mocking laugh. "Oh, don't play dumb with me. This eyesore of a fence has been violating our HOA regulations from the moment you moved in. I've warned you multiple times, and yet here we are." The code enforcement officer cleared his throat, shuffling through a stack of documents. The tension in the air was palpable. A few nosy neighbors peeked through their blinds, pretending they weren't watching the drama unfold. Elena took a step forward, her voice steady. "I received your complaints, yes, but I don't recall agreeing to remove it." Margaret snapped her fingers, stepping closer. "Then let me make it clearer. This neighborhood has standards, and your damn fence is an eyesore, a disgrace. We don't tolerate rule breakers, so I called in the professionals to deal with it." She waved dramatically at the code enforcement officer. The officer adjusted his hat and began to speak. "All right, so under the HOA's bylaws, all fences must conform to—" Elena interrupted, her voice sharp. "Hold on. Are you citing bylaws? Good, because I have some paperwork of my own." There was a moment of stunned silence. Margaret's face twitched, her confidence momentarily flickering. She had expected resistance, but not preparation. "Oh, please," Margaret scoffed, recovering quickly. "You can dig up whatever paperwork you want. It doesn't change the fact that you're violating the rules, and I'll make damn sure you pay for it." Elena smirked. "Funny thing about that. Before you keep running your mouth, maybe you should listen to what your professionals have to say." The code enforcement officer looked up sharply, his brow furrowed. "Actually, there's something strange here." Margaret whipped her head around, her eyes narrowing. "What the hell do you mean, strange?" The officer pulled out an official city document and flipped through the pages. "This can't be right. Where did you say this fence came from?" Elena crossed her arms, her smirk widening. "I didn't." Margaret's face turned red. "Oh, cut the smug act and explain yourself." The officer cleared his throat, straightening up. "Actually, according to city records, this fence was installed as part of a municipal project, 20 years ago. It's public infrastructure." A dead silence fell over the gathering. Margaret's eyes widened, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. That's impossible. That's not." "Oh, but it is," Elena said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Margaret snatched the papers from the officer's hands, scanning them frantically. The neighbors began to whisper, their amusement and curiosity growing. "Wait, so they've been harassing her over a city fence," one neighbor murmured. "This is getting good," another replied. Margaret's hand shook as she gripped the document. "This has to be a mistake." Elena took a step closer, her voice low but firm. "It's not." There was a long, heavy beat. Margaret's face contorted with barely contained rage. "You little piece of—" "You think you've won? This isn't over." She whirled on her heel and stormed off, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The neighbors burst into hushed chatter, some shaking their heads, others chuckling. Elena watched her go, exhaling slowly. She hadn't been sure how deep this fight would go, but now she had the upper hand. "Oh, it's not over," Elena muttered to herself. "But I'm damn sure ready for round two." Later that evening, Elena sat at her desk, her fingers drumming on the wood as she reviewed the city documents again. The words, public infrastructure, pedestrian safety, and installation glared back at her. Margaret Hargrove had picked the wrong fight. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was too hard, too aggressive. Elena opened the door to find Margaret standing there, arms crossed, flanked by two HOA board members, Ted, a pudgy, balding man, and Janet, a sharp-faced woman with a perpetual scowl. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Margaret sneered. Elena leaned against the doorframe, her expression calm. If proving you're full of it makes me clever, then yeah, I guess I am. Ted shifted uncomfortably, and Janet glanced away. Margaret, however, smiled. A dangerous, calculated smile. Cute. But you don't get it. The HOA runs this neighborhood, sweetheart. The city can own the fence all they want. It doesn't change the fact that we make the rules. Elena raised an eyebrow. Wow. That almost sounded like a threat. Oh, it was, Margaret said, leaning in, her voice dripping with venom. See, the bylaws say fences have to be consistent with the aesthetic harmony of the community. And guess who gets to decide what that means? Me. Do you want to play lawyer? Fine. But I promise you, I will make your life hell. She turned on her heel and walked off, Ted and Janet scurrying after her. Elena watched them go, anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. This wasn't just about the fence anymore. The next few days were a blur of tension and confrontation. Elena found herself the target of subtle and not so subtle harassment. One evening, while checking the mail, she caught her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, glaring at her from her porch. You should just follow the rules like everyone else, Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice laced with disapproval. Elena turned to face her, her expression calm but firm. The rules? Or Margaret's power trip? Mrs. Jenkins blanched but didn't answer. She scurried inside, slamming her door. Later that night, Elena heard a loud bang outside. Rushing out, she found her trash cans knocked over and garbage spilled everywhere. A spray-painted message on the sidewalk read, "Follow the rules or leave." Elena took a deep breath, refusing to give in to anger. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. All right, Margaret, she muttered. You want a war? You got one. Elena's home office became her war room. The walls were covered in pinned documents, HOA bylaws, city records, and a growing list of complaints. Patterns began to emerge. This wasn't just petty harassment. This was a racket. A notification popped up on her laptop, a response from the city records department. It was a list of who had authorized neighborhood modifications over the years. And there it was, Margaret Hargrove's name. She had personally approved the city's fence installation years ago. Gotcha, you corrupt piece of, Elena muttered, a smile spreading across her face. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. Hey, remember when you said you had a contact in investigative journalism? Yeah, I found something. Oh, I found everything. 3 days later, Elena stepped outside to find a bright orange violation notice slapped onto her front door. She ripped it off and read it, her eyes narrowing. A second document was stapled underneath, a formal letter from the HOA stating that if the fence wasn't removed within 7 days, they would initiate legal action. Elena smirked, shoving the papers into her pocket. Oh no, legal action. However will I recover? She barely got inside before her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. Yeah, this is Officer Martinez with City Code Enforcement. We received multiple complaints from your HOA. Elena rolled her eyes. You mean Margaret? Got it. What's the problem today? There was a brief pause. So here's the thing. We pulled the city records as you requested, and, you're not in violation of anything. Elena leaned back in her chair, grinning. You don't say. Yeah, but we're getting pressure to move forward with citations anyway. The grin faded. Pressure from who? Silence. Then, off the record, HOA board members have connections in local government. You're stepping on toes. They want you to fold. Elena's grip tightened on her phone. That's so, yeah? But between you and me, I don't like being used as a weapon. Let me know how this plays out. The call ended, and Elena leaned back, exhaling slowly. The HOA was flexing its power. You want to play dirty, Margaret? Fine. Let's get filthy. A week later, at the HOA's monthly meeting, the room was packed. Neighbors, board members, and even a few city officials sat tensely in folding chairs. Elena sat near the back, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on Margaret, who stood at the front, beaming with fake confidence. Before we begin, Margaret said, I'd like to remind everyone that community unity is our top priority. That means maintaining our beautiful neighborhood to the highest standards. She paused, then smirked. This brings us to our first order of business, addressing ongoing non-compliance issues. Her eyes flicked toward Elena. We have one homeowner who seems to believe they're above the rules. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably. Elena stood. Are we going to pretend this isn't personal? Margaret's smile tightened. Personal? Oh, please. This is about preserving property values, something you don't care about. A voice cut through the tension. Wait, didn't the city install that fence? Margaret's face twitched. The HOA still has the right to enforce aesthetic standards. Then why are other non-compliant fences still up? Another voice asked. Elena stepped forward, pulling out a thick folder. Here's a list of documented HOA violations that you ignored. All of them are from homeowners you like. She slammed the folder onto the table. Margaret's jaw clenched. So tell me, Margaret, Elena said, her voice rising. When did this stop being about fences and start being about control? The room erupted into tense arguments. The division was official. 2 days later, Elena stepped outside to find a moving crew unloading tools onto her lawn. A grinning man in a work vest approached. Got an order for a fence removal. Elena went ice cold. Says who? The worker frowned, flipping through his work order. HOA President Margaret Hargrove. Signed and paid in advance. A slow rage crept up Elena's spine. She glanced down the street. Margaret stood on her porch, arms folded, smirking. She lifted her phone and mouthed. Call the cops. I dare you. Elena stared her down. Hold off. You're not touching that fence. The worker shrugged. Hey, man, I just do what I'm paid to do. Elena pulled out her phone. Funny. So do lawyers. She dialed a number. Yeah, I need to report an act of property destruction in progress. The worker's eyes widened. I ain't getting arrested for this. He waved his crew back into the truck. Margaret stormed toward them. Get back here. I paid you. The workers drove off, and Elena turned to Margaret, arms crossed. Nice try, sweetheart. Margaret's face contorted with pure rage. You think you've won? Elena stepped forward, inches from her face. No, I have. Margaret's nostrils flared. She turned back inside, slamming her door so hard the porch light rattled loose. Elena exhaled slowly, watching the neighborhood react. A few neighbors stared, whispering. Some smiled. One older woman nodded in approval. Yeah, Margaret, Elena muttered. Do you feel that? That's power slipping through your fingers. The HOA emergency meeting night was chaos. The community center was packed, every seat filled, standing room only. Tension hummed in the air like an exposed wire. At the front, Margaret sat behind a table, flanked by the remaining HOA board members. She was dressed in her usual power blazer, but her hands were clasped tighter than usual. Elena sat in the front row, arms crossed, watching. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Margaret began, her voice strained. We are here to discuss repeated violations against our HOA policies and vote on appropriate action. She slid a stack of papers across the table. This homeowner has ignored multiple warnings, failed to comply with reasonable community requests, and has displayed outright hostility toward this board. The board recommends a forced removal of the offending structure and a formal fine. Elena slowly stood. I'd love to know what rule gives you the authority to do that. Margaret's smirk faltered for just a second. We don't need your input yet, dear. That's too bad, Elena said, because I think you'll want to hear this. She pulled a thick file from her bag and slapped it onto the table. The entire room leaned forward. Margaret stared at the file like it was a live grenade. Elena flipped open the file. This is a full record of all HOA enforcement actions over the last 5 years. Now, would you believe that every single major fine issued in the last 3 years has gone to a homeowner who either publicly disagreed with you or had, let's call it, an undesirable background? A few gasps echoed through the room. A couple of neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Margaret scoffed, waving it off. Oh, please. You think some conspiracy theory is going to save you? Elena pulled out another paper. Oh, and here's a fun one. I did some digging into those fines. Funny thing, half of them were settled in closed meetings with private payments. The room erupted. Wait, so where's all the money going? Someone shouted. That's fraud. Margaret stood abruptly, slamming her hands on the table. This is slander. Slander is when it's not true, Elena shot back. She pulled out one last sheet of paper. This is a request for an official state audit of the HOA's finances. A dead silence fell over the room. Margaret's face drained of all color. You little, she started, but Elena cut her off. Language, Margaret. We're in a community meeting. The neighbors started talking all at once, the room buzzing with energy. How much of our money have you stolen? Someone yelled. You've been fining us into the ground for years. Margaret tried to regain control, her voice rising. Everyone, calm down. This is a baseless attack. Then you won't mind if we let the auditors do their job, Elena said. A new voice cut through the noise. We've already begun reviewing the HOA's financials. All eyes whipped to the back of the room. A city official stood, holding a thick stack of documents. And I can confirm there are serious discrepancies in the financial records. Margaret stumbled back, her hands shaking. No, this isn't happening. Oh, but it is, Elena said, her voice cold. The room exploded. Board members whispered furiously. Neighbors started yelling. Someone in the back cheered. Margaret whirled around to the board. Say something. Do something. Ted cleared his throat. I resign. Janet immediately stood. Me too. One by one, the board members resigned, leaving Margaret alone. She looked around, realizing there was no one left to protect her. No, you can't, she stammered. You're done, Margaret, Elena said, her voice firm. Margaret's eyes burned with hatred. I'll ruin you. You already ruined yourself, Elena replied. Margaret stormed out of the room, the sound of her heels echoing in the silence. The morning after the HOA meeting, the neighborhood was buzzing like a shaken beehive. A stack of HOA resignation letters was at the community center, left behind after the disaster of the previous night. Margaret's house was silent, the curtains drawn, a car missing from the driveway. Elena stepped outside, coffee in hand, and smirked. So much for community standards. A group of neighbors walked over, shifting awkwardly. Listen, we wanted to say we didn't know how bad it was. I mean, we knew Margaret was a control freak, but we had no idea she was stealing from us. Elena raised an eyebrow. Oh, and you needed a full-blown audit to figure it out? The neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Look, all I'm saying is you took that fight head-on, and it worked. The HOA's getting investigated. Margaret's toast. He nodded at the fence. Guess that damn fence ain't going nowhere. Elena glanced at the fence, standing tall and untouched. Nope, and neither am I. A slow, reluctant chuckle spread through the group. Yeah, we were thinking maybe we could. I don't know, rebuild the HOA from scratch. Do it right this time. Elena took a sip of coffee. Good luck with that. Just leave me out of it. The neighbors nodded and shuffled off. Elena watched them go, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. The battle was over. The dictator had fallen. In the neighborhood, it would never be the same again. A month later, the HOA was officially dissolved. The city audit revealed thousands of missing HOA funds, and Margaret was facing legal trouble. Her house went up for sale. One day, Elena stepped outside to find a moving truck in the driveway. A young couple stood on the lawn, scanning the property. Elena grinned and walked over. New neighbors. The couple nodded. Yeah, we heard the last lady ran the HOA like a damn dictatorship. Elena chuckled. Not anymore. The couple looked relieved as Elena walked back to her house. She took one last glance at the fence. It was still standing strong, just like her. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.